Okay. When I was manager of system operations, and this was in about 1977, 70, just I was fairly new in it. One of the things that I noticed in the way the power system is operating is we used our interconnections with other power companies, emergency only, and we traded power back and forth in kind. If in other words, if I helped Tampa Electric Company when they lost a generator, we would send them power to help make up that. So we shared the reserves in the state. In the state of Florida, we shared reserves. So we each had, based on the size of the system, a responsibility for so much reserve that you had to keep, a 10-minute reserve, had to be available in less than 10 minutes. Available for anybody in the state that lost a power plant. Or any emergency for that matter. Just all they had is declare an emergency, we would help them out. Well, we kept a record of that and how many kilowatt hours that they used. And we paid it back at some time later. Usually, if I had an emergency, they sent it to me. But we kept a record of that, so we had a balance at the end of every month who owed what. And at that time, there was about 18 or maybe 20 generating utilities in Florida, municipal systems, REAs, and private power companies that serve the whole state. So we shared all of this reserve back and forth. But I noticed in there, I says, we're trading this stuff in kind. And I says, there's lots of times when one power company, part of the day or part of the year, has very economical power and somebody else has very expensive power. And I says, why are we trading this stuff in kind? Why don't we buy and sell it to each other? And I had taken my MBA in finance. And one of the major things that I learned in there is about stocks and bonds and trading at Wall Street and how futures and options work and all of this kind of stuff. And I says, why can't we apply that methodology to electricity and set up a market for electricity? So I thought about it a little bit and did some homework and trying to figure out how you can do it. And then I started looking, watching the power system and how we did it. We could calculate the incremental cost of power. It was kind of crude at the time, but we pretty well knew. The incremental cost of power is what it cost to generate the next megawatt or kilowatt, the kilowatt hour. What does it cost to do that? So you always bring the power system up. You operate the plants so they operate on a common incremental cost of power. Some generators were more efficient than others, so you load them up first. Some had a cheaper fuel, and they would come up. So you will always operate these on economic dispatch. So all plants would come up at the most economical use of the power.
And you're already doing that?
We were already doing that. It was manual through a manual computer that was put in. And I say manual, it was an analog computer. It's dials and stuff that you could calculate the power. Well, I said, why can't we do it? So I met with one of the managers in system planning at the time, and he and I talked about it, and says, this is an interesting concept. And it says, let's get the Public Service Commission involved. So we went and met with the head of the utility regulation in Tallahassee, and presented our concept of incremental dispatch between utilities. Instead of trading in kind, let us sell it. And he was interested in it. He says, yeah, this sounds like interesting. So they said, go back and figure out how to do it. So I got an engineer on loan from system planning, from that manager. He came over and we sat down, and in fact we did most of it on Saturday and Sunday afternoon, so sitting down and figuring out how we could buy and sell power. The concept was, and they came up with, is sell it for 1 hour. You'd look at the power system and you say, okay, we're carrying so much spinning reserve, which you required, but on top of that, you sometimes have extra capacity that you're not using. Particularly in the daytime where the load came up, you peaked about 5 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock, sometime in Florida, in the summertime it was 6 o'clock, and then you would drop off. But you've got generators coming online and stuff, and there's always, or not always, but a good portion of the time, there's excess capacity available. This is, why don't we sell that to somebody else? Well, they don't want to buy it. They got the same thing. So we started looking around and says, okay, there's the difference in price in coal, oil, and gas, and nuclear. What we'll do is okay, Tampa Electric built a brand new coal-fired unit at this time, and it was very economical, but it was bigger than their system needed. So they had reserve capacity on that unit. And I says, look, if I back down on my generators 100 megawatts, or actually I think we did in increments about 20 megawatts, so just back out 20. And the system size at this time is about 6,000 or 7,000 megawatts. So you back down a little bit, and they increase a little bit and send that power to me. And we'll price it, calculate my incremental cost. What am I saving in fuel by backing down this little bit? And what are they increasing the fuel to get the difference? So they look at their price to increase it and our price to save, and we split the difference. Half the profit goes to the person that backs down and half to the guy that increased his. We tried it on a test basis, on a few 1 hour basis, with the dispatchers getting on the phone and calculating their incremental and decremental costs. Well, it was done manually. A lot of them didn't know where they were. In fact, I found that the municipal utilities were the worst. They didn't have any idea how much it was costing them to generate their power. So we dealt with the investor-owned, because the investor-owned had to report this to the Public Service Commission. So we pretty well knew what our costs were. So since everybody had about the same thing, and we started with investor-owned utilities, I think it was 7 of us that started, with one municipal utility. It was Orlando Utilities. I remember that one because they were very progressive and they knew where they were. But anyway, we calculated that and did a split price string, did a test basis for a month, looked at the results, how much money we saved. And they said, this is really good. So we have a statewide organization called the Operating Committee, the Florida Operating Committee. And at that time, I was a member of that for Florida Power and Light. I was the representative. Since I was a manager of operations, I was also the one. We met once a month to go over operatings and emergencies and how we helping each other and who owes what power to whom and all this stuff. And I proposed this to them about this incremental decremental, and I had a presentation put together and sold it on some of them participating. So we started out with 4 that tried it for this test period. And then the next month we reported this, and everybody was quite shocked. Boy, we can really save some money or make some money. And it keeps the bills down. So it says, okay, let's go for a year. So we set up an operation to do it during certain hours during a year. And this is about 1977 or so. Or early 78, I think it was. We ran about 3 or 4 months, and it was a lot of work because it was manual on the phone and stuff like that. So I said, well, this is going to be really a good thing. Everybody seemed to like it, the ones that were participating. Others started looking at it and said, we want to get in. So I wrote a plan of how everybody could get involved in it. We purchased a computer. That day it was a great big mainframe type of computer, and used the terminal units were old teletypes, World War II type teletypewriters. And then we got the early version of the computer screen with the keyboard on, like the mainframe desktop things, only you had a big computer behind it and you had just this monitor that had everything in it. But anyway, we eventually automated the system and got it going and set up an organization under a separate committee under the operating committee to manage the Florida broker. That's what we call it, the Florida broker system. And it grew the next year with participants coming on it, and we had eventually had all 20 generating companies on it. And I remember the 1 year, after 1 full year of operation, the amount of money we saved was in the millions of dollars. And it went to the fuel adjustment, Florida had passed the fuel adjustment a year or so earlier, about that time, so that what it is when you burn fuel in the power plants, they didn't want, because the fuel was volatile back in the 70s. We had an energy crisis back then. And they said, well, since the prices are going up and down, the companies were struggling to remain profitable with this, so they got together and petitioned for this fuel adjustment. So the company would not make any money on the fuel. It's just, okay, we don't make any profit. Whatever it costs, we pass it to the customer. And you had to go testify to the Public Service Commission every 6 months of what the fuel adjustment would be for the next 6 months, and then you would true it up. So it was a constantly catch-up game to do that. Well, all of the savings, when we were saving money from buying power, that went into the fuel adjustment. The company didn't make any money from it. It was just a savings to the fuel. Well, it lowered the bills, and by the millions of dollars. Anytime we sold power, the profit went to the company for that little bit over it. And it was pennies on the dollar in what you were making. Well, one year, the first year of operating, I think it was in 79 or 80, it amounted to 9 cents a share for Florida Power and Light. I remember calculating that number, and I thought, wow, we increased the profit for 9 cents. Well, the Public Service Commission took note of this, and it says, that's a windfall profit. We're not going to let you earn that extra bonus. We're going to put it to the fuel, because that gives you the capability of doing it. We're letting you, in their base rates, the cost of the power plant is in the base rates. The fuel is a pass-through. This sale was a pure profit. That's not fair. So they says, and I wasn't involved in it, but the commission passed the rule that says you can keep 20% of it, 80% of it's going to go to the fuel adjustment. So that's what it turned out. It's interesting because years later, I ran across the chairman of the Public Service Commission. He had retired from the government service, and I met him in Tallahassee accidentally at some event. And he knew me, and we talked about that thing. And he says, you know, I was willing to go 50-50, but your company agreed to 80-20. And I said, that's great. So we gave it away. And I said, but anyway, that broker system turned out to be a major contributor to lowering fuels. The thing that I didn't like is the fuel adjustment kind of removed the incentive for people to do much on it. But the municipal utilities didn't have that. They did, and they enjoyed great benefits, particularly a small utility. A small utility's got 1 or 2 generators. We're able to go on the Florida broker and buy a high percentage of their electricity at relatively low rates. So it helped the citizens of Florida tremendously. Well, going further on, after I became vice president of power delivery, and when the company did a reorganization, I was a vice president of power planning and delivery, I think is what we called it at that time. But the next level was basically an executive vice president of power delivery, and there was actually 3 or 4, I think it was, 4 major presidents, vice presidents of the company. One had power delivery, and that was responsible for everything in the dispatch of the power system, fuels, power trading, system planning, contracts. All of that was under the vice president of power delivery. Then you had the vice president of fossil generation, which that was responsible for all of the fossil plants. We had the vice president of nuclear generation, and then we had the vice president of retail sales, residential retail sales. I had all the wholesale stuff under me. That was about 9 or 10% of the total generation was sold wholesale. So anyway, that was we were the ones that ran the company, and I was on the executive management board.
So you went straight from the director of...
I went from director of power supply to vice president of power plant and delivery when my boss retired.
Okay.
He retired at that time, and I got his job because I had again relief for him when he was on vacation and stuff. I would take over and run all of this stuff. So he liked it that way, because many times when it was something came up he didn't really want to handle, he'd give it to me, and I'd take care of it. So I ran the power plant and delivery for about 2 years. That's about all. And in that, I gained the control of the fuel department, is buying and selling oil, and that's the reason we started the trading operation. With the power part that I had started as manager of system operations with the Florida broker, now I had the fuel. And putting all of that together was very powerful. The one thing that I really didn't like, during that time, we had a reorganization. We had a new president and chairman of the board come on board, who were not engineers, they were lawyers. And we reorganized. But I became the head of all of that division, plus contracts and everything. So I had 6 departments reporting to me, 6 major units, which had managers. They were directors, and there was managers on them, ran all of the other departments. It was about 2,400 employees, I guess, something like that. And one of the things that happened during that time is when he came on board, he did not like our trading operation. I had set up trading operations where we were buying and selling oil, gas, and coal. We were negotiating fuel contracts, delivery contracts for the railroads, for the coal, pipelines for the oil and gas, and all of that was under my responsibility. So we had a major portion of the company going in it. And I had set up this trading operation so we could deal on the market with oil and stuff. We were burning at that time about 9% of the total residual oil in the eastern United States coming out of West Texas, about 9% of that at all our power plants. Well, one little event happened in that when I was running that is I remember the manager of fuels coming to me one time, and he said, "We got an opportunity to buy some cheap fuel oil." And I said, "Well, how much is it?" And he said, "Well, it's 2 tankers. It's on the world market right now, about 500,000 barrels each." And they were Russian, headed for Cuba. And the Cuban crisis had all been over years ago, but so this is when Russia was supporting Cuba. Well, it got to be an argument because Cuba was paying for this oil with sugar from the sugar industry. Well, they couldn't produce enough, and anyway, there was an argument between the head of Russia, I think it was Khrushchev at the time, and Castro, and they said, "We're not going to deliver the oil." Well, it was already in the high seas. So the tankers pulled into the Grand Bahamas port and put the oil on the world market for sale. Well, manager of fuels come to me and says, "We got a chance to buy these 2 tankers at about half price of what we're paying out of West Texas." And he says, "The only problem is they own Russian tankers." And I said, "Boy, that we're in a Cold War and stuff, and Russia's kind of." Says, "Yeah, but it's a good price." So we sit there and talked about it a little bit. And I says, "Well, okay, we've got a terminal at Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale. You know where Port Everglades is, and we got some 800,000 barrel tanks. I think I'm right on the size of them. Maybe in 300,000 on those tankers and 500,000 tanks. I can't remember the number. But anyway, it was a major tank farm at Port Everglades, right on the port. And we normally take oil from the tankers right into our tanks, and the power plant's sitting right there. And then rather than that, right into the power plant. So it didn't have to be piped or shipped anywhere. We had total control of it. So I said, "Well, if we buy that, can we bring them in at night?" And he says, "Well, legally, there's no reason you can't. There's no legal laws. You're not breaking any laws and stuff. It's just political public sentiment toward it." So I said, "Okay, bring them in and back the stern of one ship to the stern of the other. So you can't see the acrylic name, the acrylic level. I think it's called the Russian alphabet. Anyway, you couldn't see the name of the ships. And in the U.S. port, they have to fly the American flag to let them know that you're in the area. But you normally fly your country flag too. They don't have to fly that. There's no laws there, just the American flag." So we brought them in at night. Next day we unloaded them, took them back out, back to sea. We got that oil, and I remember the lab calling me and says, "You bought Bunker C?" That's what we burned in the plant, called Bunker C. "You bought Bunker C for the plant?" And says, "This stuff doesn't test like this. It tests like crude. A lot hotter, a lot more volatiles." And I said, "We could refine this and make gasoline." And I said, "No, we can't do that." And he says, "Well, tell you what we'll do. We'll go to the world market and buy some of the cruddiest stuff coming out of West Texas that doesn't meet our specifications. Really poor stuff. It's almost asphalt. You bring it in and dilute it with this good stuff to bring it down to the specs." So we went out and we bought, there must have been like 10 tankers of this over the next month or so of oil coming into the power plants, and blended our fuel so that we could bring it down to, we had to take out some, it was so hot, it would burn, it burned up a boiler. It had so much combustibles in it. So it was really good stuff. Anyway, we burned that over the next month, and we saved, I don't know how many millions of dollars. The company never got any benefit out of it, but the customers benefited tremendously out of it. We were able to keep rates down. We reduced rates. Electric rates dropped in our area with a broker system that turned out to be very good. So we were doing a very good job, I thought. The new president came in. He didn't like what I was doing with the trading operation. He says, "Why are you doing that?" And I says, "We're saving the customers millions of dollars every year." And he says, "The fuel adjustment doesn't recognize that." He says, "We're going to cut it out. We're going to thin this department down." And I says, "Sorry, we're very profitable. This is a very profitable thing." He says, "The stockholders are not benefiting. You're costing the stockholders money because the operation of the trading, the salaries for those people were all part of the company operation, administrative operations. So stockholders are paying for that, and they're not getting any benefit out of it. What's that? They are through the brokerage system, and that's saving and making money for the company." He says, "We're going to cut it out." So he did. And I said, "Well, I don't think it's the right thing." So he and I didn't hit it off very well. And anyway, we cut out the trading operation, which I thought was a mistake. Then he put in the cost of anything having to do with fuels. When we rented tanks or stuff like this, or paid extra for things that were not fuel-based, but they were related to fuel. He said, "Anything related to fuel, we're going to put it into fuel adjustment." And I says, "Well, I'll go testify to that thing to the," he says, "Oh no." He says, "There's nothing in the law that says that you have to do that." And I says, "Sir, that's not right. You got to tell the regulators." And he says, "You're going to testify that all of this is for fuel." I says, "I can't do that. That's morally wrong." He says, "You're not a team player." I says, "Well, it may not be, but you'll have to get somebody else to do that." He says, I don't think it's the right thing to do, and you'll have to get somebody else." And he thought about it, and I went home. That was a meeting in his office one afternoon, and then the next morning he says, "Okay, call all your direct reports together. I've got some important news." And I said, "Okay, we're going to go." So I called all my 6 department heads and my secretary into the conference room, got a conference call. His office was in Juno Beach, and mine was in Miami. So they were in my conference room, and had the thing set up about at 8 or 8:30 in the morning. I think it was 8 o'clock. He wanted them early. Or maybe it was 8:30. I think it was around 8:30. Anyway, we were all there, and he was the pleasantries, good morning, all this kind of stuff. And he says that I was retiring, and my replacement would be walking in the door in about 5 minutes. I looked around. My manager's faces, all of them just went white as a sheet. I said, "I guess I'm retiring." So I opened the door. Well, the door opened right behind me, and this the manager of the budget department walks in. He was a director, I think, director of budgets. He walks in. He says he's the new vice president of power delivery. So I says, "Okay." And I walk out. They closed the door and went on. And I went and talked to my secretary, and she said, "This is a surprise. You didn't tell me about it. You were going to retire." I said, "I didn't know it." Anyway, he faxed down a letter that was already pre-drafted for my signature that I was retiring to pursue other interests. So that was the end of my career with Florida Power and Light. I called Diane, and I had turned in my ID badge, my company car, and I left through the front door with an escort to the front door, and Diane come pick me up. And that was about noon on that day, and that was it.
What year was that?
That was in 1993. And the irony of it was, in 1992, when Hurricane Andrew hit, the power system never truly blacked out, but we lost all of everything south of Fort Lauderdale due to the storm. We had 53 substations in the dark. We only had one transmission line that stayed in to the West Miami big switching station called Flagler, and it served a little bit of load in West Miami, and that was the only thing in there. And we had put that system back together, rebuilt the transmission lines. All of this where people were working 7 days a week, from, as we said, can to can. You'd come to work, and you'd work, and you rebuild that power system. Interesting thing, I have one fond memory of that is this was about day 3 after Hurricane Andrew had tore up the entire South Florida area. We had called every power company contractor in the southeastern United States to assist us in rebuilding the power system. And we used one of the Turnpike plazas, the one in South Miami, as a marshalling yard. We had contacted the Highway Patrol, and they made it available to us because it had a restaurant in it, and it had a backup generator that was feeding the restaurant. And we helped them get that all going. And they, of course, kept the public out, but they turned that whole plaza over to us in our restoration for the power delivery people, just the people that reported to me. And we had called in, and I remember that morning, I was going to, when everybody was coming in, trucks from everywhere, and parking in the parking area there. And I remember the sun just coming up first light. I had a platform, we had a trailer brought in, a flatbed trailer, and a platform with a PA system on it. And I got on the PA system and welcome everybody to South Florida. Thanks for helping us, thanks for coming down. And looked out at all the different colors of vehicles of different power companies in the Southeast. Ours were orange, and then you had some blue ones, red ones, white ones, all different kinds. And it was an armada. It was just amazing how many. And I gave them a safety speech about being careful, and if you need anything, we had a temporary radio system set up with a tower there and command headquarters right there in that plaza to coordinate the restoration. And we were running out of poles, so we bought a train load of power poles from somewhere at a treatment plant, and they brought in 100 cars of power poles. We bought all the poles that could be gathered in South Florida, and I mean in southeastern United States. So we had a number of poles that came in untreated. They were at the treatment plant to be treated, and said, "We'll take them. We need them." So we had a number of car loads of these untreated poles, and said, "Well, we'll use them temporarily till we get the power system, and then when we get time, we'll come back and change them out and put in treated ones." But we restored the power system all that time, and I had worked everybody for 6 months, 6 days a week. For the first month, we worked 7 days a week, and then we started working 6 days, and give them 1 day off, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And that, of course, a lot of overtime. The people liked it because they were making good money on it, and getting the power. But we had restored the power system in record time. And with all of that, and the work we had done, then this thing comes up about the fuel adjustment. And it made me angry with the company. I was furious when they let go. And finally I decided that's not going to help a thing. It's history. So the one thing I did negotiate was that in the release, it says, I've got cause to sue you. But I'm not. I don't do that. And he says, well, I was under a performance plan that my pay, or a good portion of my pay, was based on performance to certain objectives and stuff. And there was different levels set in the basic level, and then a mid-level, and then a higher level. If you accomplish all of these higher level goals, you get the maximum benefit. Well, it's set up so that you never really can hit the top, or you're not supposed to, but it's way up there. I says, all right, assume all of my goals are met, and I get 100% payout of all the bonuses for the last 4 years. And the stock in the 401k plan, I would immediately, you have to usually be there so many years to be vested in it. All of that comes due right now. Well, we did it and negotiated it so that half of it came due right then, and another half 6 months later, so I could draw it out. Well, anyway, I left Florida Power and Light, got that, and started my own consulting company. That's when I started doing consulting work. And I went to Jamaica and did an investigation of their blackouts in their system. I was offered the position at the end of that 2-week period to run the Jamaican power system. And I said, not on your life. I'm not going to do that. So then eventually we moved to our house in North Carolina. Did you ever remember that house? You remember the house over there? Well, we lived there for about a year, and I started doing consulting work for TVA, and that led to the job with TVA. Okay. The power marketing thing came about, like I said, from the results of my MBA and things, and I got to thinking about why we can't market electricity like the stock market, and came up with this 1 hour plan of splitting the price, as we call it, splitting the savings, and that worked out. Well, the scheme developed to a computerized model, and what we did is on the clock hour is when you started your schedule. So the clock started, as we were talking, the clock hour, and for the first 15 minutes, it gives the operator time to calculate his costs for the next hour, to do any calculations. By 30 minutes past the hour, you put your quotes in the computer, what you're willing to buy and sell at, how much. And you can do it in 3 blocks, the way we set it up, in 3 blocks. You can do it 10 megawatts, 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts. You can do 3 10s, 3 50s, or any combination of that. And buy and sell, if you wanted to do that. Strictly voluntary. Anyway, I had it as a practice at Florida Power and Light, since we were the ones that initiated this thing, is that all the operators, I put on a special operator, because we could make so much money and save so much for the customer. We had a new shift set up with a terminal just strictly for the marketing system. And I says, you quote every hour what you're willing to buy and sell for. 3 blocks. Everybody has to do that. That's mandatory, calculated. Well, what it did is that some of the power plants started to say, well, you know, it costs me more than just fuel to pick up the power. And I says, okay. What does it cost you? Well, it's increasing the wear and tear a little bit. Calculate it. So I got the accounting department involved in it. Okay, yeah, you don't want to be too high, you don't want to be too low, but you want to truly compensate for your cost, the variable cost of the plant. I want to calculate every bit of that so you know what it costs you to raise generation a little bit, or what you save, because it's not the same on each side. It's a little bit different. But you calculate, if you back down 100 megawatts on the system, how much is that on each generator that's regulating on the system? Because you got these units that's on what we call on regulation from the master computer. The computer sending the signals, and it's raising and lowering the generation in increments of less than a megawatt. And then just open the throttle a little bit, or back it down, up and down, as you follow the load during the day. Well, the operator's function is to estimate what the load is going to be, and he's got a program to help him do that for the next hour. He starts basically on the clock hour before that hour starts, so it's actually 2 hours in advance that he's calculating the cost for each of those increments, 10 megawatts, 100 megawatts. What I did to give them some incentive in it, since I couldn't give them any bonus out of that, I said, okay, I want to give them an incentive. So I says, all right, what we'll do is we'll treat each month, we'll calculate who did the most during their shift. How much money did you save the customer or make the company? And if you were the top operator during that month, I would treat them and their family to a dinner at one of the finest restaurants in Miami. Just you go and just charge it to me. So that became known as the Hamburger in the Sky Award. So they fought over that thing, not so much for the meal, that it was the prestige.
Yeah.
It became a prestige thing of, I'm going to be the top winner this month. And they say, well, it's not fair because sometimes you've got more generation or you've got the ability to buy or sell more than other times. And I said, it'll average out over time. You get the same opportunity. You're on a rotating shift. You get the day shift. They say, well, the day shift gets the better opportunity, or the night shift gets a better opportunity. It was always arguments of who had the advantage. And I said, it'll average out. And it did, usually, because it wasn't the same guy always winning it. It was different ones. But it became the prestige of the thing, because we had a monthly meeting of the operators, and we'd go over new procedures, and it's a training session of updated the training sessions. And then at the end of the meeting, with the exception of the guys on shift, everybody that was on the shifts would come in for that meeting. It was usually a 1-hour meeting, and we did it usually around after the shift went off at 4 o'clock. We'd stay from 4 to 5 and have our meeting. So the people on shift that ended at 4 could stay over and come in, and then anybody on the night shift, it was optional where you wanted to come to the meeting or not. But most of the time everybody did. And then the shift it was on had to relieve the 4 o'clock shift for the 4 to midnight run, so they were on duty. But usually we would try to do is hold the meeting in the control center so that it would not distract from the gun. It was kind of off to the side, but they could pay attention to it as conditions warranted on the thing. So they pretty well knew what was going on. Anyway, we would do that every month, and it was always a prestige of who was the marketer doing the thing, and who the system operator was, because the marketer was a position under the system operator. The system operator had responsibility for all the generation, the fuel burn, the transmission system, and the marketing. So he had all of that overview. But each one of those positions had an operator on the desk that was managing that aspect of the operation. But anyway, this power marketing thing kind of grew over time. Since we automated it, it was a big thing. Well, the rules kind of changed as the fuel adjustment thing entered into it, but it was doing very well. It was saving millions of dollars a year, and other utilities got to really liking it. In fact, some of the smaller municipal utilities had some diesels that they were running. It were just very inefficient, and they decided to shut them down. And it says, okay, if we shut them down, it's going to be a longer term thing. So, well, we started figuring, can we expand this thing? Instead of being a 1-hour market, can we make a day ahead market? So you could shut down a unit. So that was the next phase that we entered into, was the shutting down of units and saving startup cost and shutdown costs. Because when you're running a plant, there's a certain amount of time when you start one up before you get it ready for control that you're burning fuel and all to heat it up, but you're not making electricity. You're just getting the plant up to temperature. It's like a car. You got to get the temperatures up before it really runs very well. Ask Volkswagen about that, because they got caught in that debacle with startup and shutdown. It's a big controversy today in the power industry because of emissions right now with the EPA. Is it used to, when startup and shutdown, you excluded those periods because the plant's not up to temperatures. So your emissions are different than, it's like a car. If you've seen, you start up a car and you look at the exhaust, what comes out of the exhaust right at startup? Sometimes a little puff of smoke would come out. Well, the catalytic converter's cold. It's not really converting. things are not to normal temperature. Once they get to operating temperature, everything works fine.
Yeah.
Same thing. Anyway, we came up with a procedure for day ahead. So that was the next thing, is a day ahead market. So we started that. That was not automated at the time, but we put in power marketers. And the reason being is you can do a little bit more planning on that. You talk about day ahead, week ahead, 2 days ahead, a month ahead, 6 months ahead, a year ahead. What market you talking about? Well, it eventually, from the day ahead market, expanded to all of those time periods. So the marketer became a guy on the desk that's like a stockbroker. And he's sitting there, okay, I can buy stocks now, or I can buy a futures contract for delivery at a later time. So that's what we did. And we did it with coal, oil, gas, and power. Got that trading operation going. And that was the full-time operator of the marketing department. The fuel department got involved because they were buying fuel. That was their primary, to buy fuel for the plant. So it was a small department. I initiated, when I took over the fuel department, the trading of these futures. Well, at times, we could come in, and the example was that Russian oil that we got. Well, we could generate power quite cheap. Do you share that with the rest of the world? Well, yeah. What is the value of power to be generated next hour or next day? What is the value of that? Is it the oil that you've got in your tank now? Or is it the barrel of oil that you're going to buy to replace that tank? So the concept is, it's the replacement cost. What you got in your tank is history. Mm-hmm. If it costs you $10 or $100, it's immaterial. It's what it's going to cost you to replace it. So what I'm going to sell the power for is not what it's in the tank, but what I'm going to pay for it to replace it. So that's a very important concept, because I never could get that across to some people. They said, oh, it's what you paid for it. In fact, the regulatory people are the worst in understanding replacement costs.
So is that how gasoline prices are kind of calculated?
Yes.
Okay.
The market works off of that. It's replacement cost. What you paid for stock today is immaterial. What you paid yesterday is immaterial. It's what you're going to pay if you had to buy that stock tomorrow. Important economic concept. Mm-hmm. By setting that up in the fuel, we could buy fuel on the futures market and never use it. How much risk are you willing to take? How much market power do you have? What is your contacts? So the marketer becomes a true entrepreneur of sitting there trying to find the best deals that he can. And he buys the futures. Who sells futures? Oil producers, mining companies, gas producers, electric power plants. Oh my goodness, here we come back to electricity again. How do you do that? Well, I got a power plant over here. I could run it or I could shut it down. It doesn't have any fuel. Tell you what, this guy over here has got the fuel. I'll buy this fuel and put it in that power plant. If you tell me how much it costs to use the fuel that you don't buy, do you use it in your plant and sell the electricity to me? Well, there's some incremental cost. You got to man the plant. You're going to wear and tear it. You got depreciation. Figure all that in there. Come and give me a price of how much it's to operate it sans fuel. I put the fuel in it and I get the electricity. New concept. This became the trading operation. It turned out to be worth millions of dollars. We got it going in Florida. It was under the Florida Public Service Commission, and we kept them informed about what we were doing. I had regular meetings up there with the guy. In fact, the head of the Department of Electric Regulation got an award from the governor and the cabinet for this innovative marketing system that he helped build in Florida. And how much money he saved the customers. And I went and see him after this, and he said, you know, I understand where it comes from. And I said, that's okay. I'm not proud. You don't deserve the recognition. You worked with us the whole process along the way. If you hadn't have done that, it would have never happened. So you deserve the recognition. Even though it did say you invented it, that doesn't matter to me, but you deserve it.
For not putting on the brakes, basically.
Yeah. Well, he understood enough, and when he had questions, he would call. So I met with him regularly. And he kept the commission informed. So they saw it, and they really liked it. Well, when this whole thing, this power marketing thing went on, we had an automated system for the 1 hour market, and marketers for the next hour and beyond, what we call the next day market. Really, it was the next day market, which was next day to way out in time. And we were doing a lot of trading. I don't remember how many marketers that we had. We had some in the fuel department. We had some in the control center. They were doing the fuel, and that was a daily meeting between the two. Says, okay, what do we got going? Who's got the best deals? You got power plants. Can you put fuel in this plant? Well, we don't own that plant. Somebody else does, but we can get the power from it. We got transmission between the two. You got to negotiate with the transmission dispatcher to make sure that you got that. So we set up methods of communicating and had a coordination meeting every morning, and usually at 10 o'clock, to go over all of those aspects for the next day. The hour market was almost an independent thing. It ran by the computer and an operator, and he just had to keep feeding it numbers. And you had to have the accounting department feeding things. If efficiency runs, we had the plants involved in it. In fact, I even would go around to the plants when I was the vice president. I'd go around to the plants and make talks to the plant managers meeting as often as I could. At least once a month I was around to plants. Sometimes I'd be gone 5 days and hit 5 different plants and meet with their operators to show them what they're doing and how important it is to know what you're doing. When they ran efficiency tests, where that number actually goes in the computer and how they get compensated for it. The plant managers loved it because when they came up with budgets and needed money to enhance this pump over here to make it a little bit more efficient because it would reduce their cost by a penny, man, they'd go in there and do it. The budget department got behind it. Says, well, gee, you know, if I spend so many $1 million upgrading this system over here on this plant, he gets more money. Well, the plant managers are always hammering in there. One thing was gas and trading gas. We worked with the Florida Gas Transmission people to move gas between power plants. We had power plants all the way from Palatka to Turkey Point, which is south of Miami, each tapping the pipeline. Gas contracts are bought a lot of times on an annual basis or a multi-year basis. A municipal gas system that serves residential customers has to plan for what demand they're going to have. Well, what if they plan in this particular month or day or week, they need X gas to meet their customers' needs, and they buy too much? What do they do with it? Take a pay. A lot of gas contracts would take a pay. You take it and pay for it. Well, we set up the gas trading operation. They did it in 4-hour increments because the 4 hours is how much gas that you could pack in a pipeline, and it's kind of like a sponge. You can put so much into it and the pressure goes up, and you can hold that in there, and then you let the pressure come down and you take it out. So you got 4 hours to move it. Gas would come on the market for 4 hours. The gas operator would call, say, Cape Canaveral plant, says, okay, we got 4 hours of gas that's coming to you starting on the clock hour. Can you switch over from oil to gas? Well, it used to, when I first took over that operation, it takes us 1 hour to 2 hours to change over from oil to gas. Meeting with the plant, and I says, look, we're going to set up an incentive program here, and I work with the human resources to where they did. So the plant manager could get a little bonus if he could optimize his gas burn. So they got very interested in how fast they could convert. So it got down to 15 minutes. We called the plant, okay, 15 minutes, we can cut the boil burners out and put the gas burners in, and we start taking that gas. Okay, you're only going to get it for 4 hours, and you got to cut it back over to oil. Okay, so they came up with their old hamburger in the sky incentives to their operators to say, okay, we're going to take this into account, and we're going to burn this dump gas, as we call it, because sometimes it comes in dirt cheap. We turn around and say, we don't need the electricity. We throw it on the power marketer for the 4 hours. It says, okay, you got 400 megawatts of extra power here, sell it on the market to the best price you can get for it. And so they would put it in the price there, and it would match up. Says, okay, we're going to use this, and Orlando Utilities is going to buy it for this 4 hours, or next hour, and then the next hour, and the next hour. Or sometimes the marketers would get it and says, look, I can sell that block for a little bit more over here for 4 hours, all 4 hours. And this company over here has got a diesel they want to bring on for the next 4 hours for the peak load. They don't have to bring that on. So we'll sell the whole 4 hours to them. That was the type of phone calls that you had, what power marketing was all about. Never existed until I became the manager of system operation and created the whole power marketing. Enron got interested in it. Let me get into the Enron story. Enron, where did it come about? Well, we were buying gas from Enron. They were a major gas, and they saw what was going on in the Florida market, and they were able to start optimizing their pipeline and the throughput, because it takes about a day from the time you stick in a molecule of gas in Houston till it dumps out in Miami. It takes that long to move. Once you get the pipeline flowing, you can't shut it off. You can close the valve, but it's going to blow. It's going to blow the safeties. You know that from your engineering training, that gas is not compressible to the total degree that you can just stop it and hold it. It's got to go. So you can design the system for it. So Enron sees what we're doing in Florida, and they talk to our dispatchers, our gas dispatcher, and says, all right, we're going to send extra gas into Florida and pump up the pipeline as much as we can, and we get it going. But think, you've got to take it for the next 24 hours. If we're going to put this extra gas, you've got to take it, and we'll give you a special price on it. Send it on. We'll market that stuff. So they were beginning to benefit out of this. So they saw what we were doing to power plants about buying fuel for somebody else's plant. We'd like to get in that game. When I was with Florida Power & Light, I can't talk to you about that. Well, when I left Florida Power & Light, over the fuel debacle is one of the major things, and plus the president did not understand power marketing at all. He didn't want to. That was my biggest complaint. Don't bother me with the details. And then he says, we got a fuel adjustment. We don't need to be doing any of that. Shut it down. And I just, you can't. It's just worth so many $1 million. But anyway, I left FP&L and I set up EPOD, Electric Power Operations and Delivery. It was an interesting way of getting the name because I needed some name that indicated what we were going to do. It was basically power marketing is what I was going to do. Well, it turned in the first job I had after I left FP&L was down in Jamaica, and that was reliability system of investigating why their power system shut down. They had no clue what caused it. And I spent 2 weeks down there. Diane was royally treated in a 5-star hotel and had a driver and escorts to shop, and I had a driver and everything driving me around all over Jamaica. And if you want me to get into that story, other than just but after that job, then the major effort was in power marketing. And that's where I thought the concept of what we were doing in Florida, to me, was so successful, and we were doing it, and others outside were now looking at us. And I knew the people in the Southeast region, in fact, all over the U.S. I knew a lot of the heads of power companies because when I was in Florida, I became the chairman of the Florida Operating Committee. That's the one that runs all the operations. Also, I had an interesting position because I had military experience and had a secret clearance. There is a special organization set up by the federal government at that time called the Defense Power Authority, I think that was the name, DPA. And what its job was is it was only activated in case of a national emergency, an attack on U.S. soil. The President could activate the Defense Power Agency, and there was pre-designated people trained in emergency operations, because basically at that time the federal government could take over control of the entire electric grid in the United States for the defense of the U.S. Because I had, again, the Navy experience, secret clearance, I was selected among all the operators of all the power systems in Florida to be the Florida coordinator in case of a national emergency. I had to go to Kirkland Air Force Base in Albuquerque for 2 weeks training in scenarios of nuclear attack on U.S. soil. Did that training. Also, in the weekend after that was over, we went up to Shama and took the Shama to Toltec train ride.
Oh.
Had to figure that in there.
Yeah.
That was a real neat train ride. But anyway, we did that training. Well, after I had that, and then I became the chairman of all the operators in Florida. After that tour, I got elected to the Southeast Region, and I was the Southeast Region chairman of the Electric Reliability Council, which now is a federal thing. But back then, the utilities used to run it, and we elected representatives to run it. So I ran that. So I got to know all of the utilities from Louisiana northward through to Ohio, because Kentucky was in it, and all the way east to the eastern seaboard, north through Virginia to Washington D.C. line. That whole southeast region was the southeast region. It was called the North American Electric Reliability Council, and it turned into the National Electric Reliability Council, NERC, which eventually now is migrated into a self-regulating organization under the Department of Energy that's responsible for reliability of the electric power grid, which I think is a mistake, putting it under government control. Because one of the things that happened when I was the chairman of the Southeast Region, we had a special meeting in the Department of Energy in the Forrestal building in Washington, D.C., and I had to go in there for a hearing, and they were called key operating people around the country in to talk about the National Control Center that they were building in the basement of the Forrestal building. And I don't know whether it's ever built or not, but we went down and it was under construction when we were there, so I assume it is. And what they wanted is control capability of all of the power grid in the United States. They wanted to put in a remote control unit in our control center through telemetry, take all of our key operating things to Washington so that the Washington people and the Department of Energy could see what we're doing. And they wanted a list of all the critical facilities that we had for national security. They want to know where our vulnerable points was and what we've done about them. And I remember that meeting because after they started talking this, they were into their presentation of how good this was going to be for the country and how great security. I says, wait a minute. I don't agree to that. So everybody kind of looks at me. I says, first of all, if you make a list in the federal government, one thing for sure is if there's any terrorists that want to find out, they'll find out through the government. Right now, they don't know what it is because we won't tell them. And you want to aggregate all of that so you know all the vulnerable points of where they could shut down the power grid of the United States in one place, and it's going to be under the politicians' control? We don't want to be part of it. So I says, Florida is not going to do this. Boy, they got upset. Anyway, that broke up the meeting. And everybody else, and I remember the guy from Texas came and he said, boy, I'm glad you said that. That was exactly what I was thinking. Nobody would say it in front of their face. Of course, I got on a list they didn't like.
Yeah.
But anyway, we didn't do it. We didn't put this list together. It kind of fell apart. I don't know whether that National Control Center ever got built or not.
I bet you it did, especially after probably the Patriot Act and 9/11. Because I know right after 9/11, like the Chickamauga Dam, all these places were put on lockdown, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because I was I actually left TVA by that time, and so I didn't know. You were interning with them. No, Mike didn't intern. Yeah, Mike did. Just Mike was interning. Yeah, when that was going on. So, but anyway,
I just remember like you used to be able to very easily go watch the locks.
Oh yeah, we used to go in there and watch the boats go through the locks. That was great.
Yeah.
Go up to Raccoon Mountain, go down to the power plant. I've been all through that plant in TVA. Well, anyway, the kind of the history on when I started doing consulting work, the power marketing was the thing that I was really interested in, because I could see where that would be so beneficial to the U.S. if you could. And my focus was the Southeast region. If we could get all the utilities in the Southeast to do what we were doing in Florida, how much money it could save and how low the electric bills could be. We could bring down the prices of electricity over the whole range, as we did in Florida. And so I started going around, and this was on my own dime most of the times, and making presentations to the people that I knew. So I'm now not with Florida Power & Light. I'm running this company, and I had a presentation put together on using PowerPoint, and I'd go in and get these meetings with the key people in the power companies all around the Southeast and do this. Well, one that I did was TVA, because I knew Mary Sharp Hayes was the president of my equivalent job of power delivery in Florida, and I had met with her because we were talking about building a transmission line to the Bellefonte nuclear plant site in Alabama to South Florida, a DC line. Prior to that was the thing that I was big on too, is DC transmission for moving blocks of power across the country. So I studied up on that and was quite verbal in what was going on, because I had been on the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, in that, and that was one of the things they were doing is research on DC transmission. And I said, this is the way. Edison was right. The cheapest way to move electricity over long distance is by DC, not AC. Well, this country was built up in the Westinghouse model of AC. For one reason, we didn't have the ability to convert DC to higher voltages economically, whereas AC is the transformer. Yeah. That was the one thing that made it worthwhile. But today with power electronics, it's easy to do. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was coming because there was a few DC lines around that did it. But they used big old mercury vapor power electronics using tubes. But it could be done with power electronics. Today, that's how it's done today, and they're much smaller devices. But anyway, so it was the DC transmission and that, and I had worked with TVA, and it was an intriguing thing because Mary Sharp Hayes was quite interested in it, because TVA was trying to justify continuing the construction of the Bellefonte nuclear plant. What got in the way is the TVA Act that prohibits TVA from selling power to any utility other than the original utilities that they were interconnected with in 1957. It was the TVA Self-Financing Act. It was passed back in 1957 by Congress, and basically what they were doing is trying to, it was pushed by the utilities around, because TVA was growing its territory, and TVA had the advantage of being a federal power agency and not a private power company. So they had a tax advantage, they had power of eminent domain in all of the states, whereas the utilities didn't have the freedom to do all of that. And I knew it. But with Florida Power & Light, we looked at it and said, okay, there's ways to do this. If you can't sell power directly, can we invest in it? Well, that brought up a lot of questions. So we were meeting at the time when I had to leave Florida Power & Light about where to go with this project. So it basically died when I left. But by that, I had known Mary Sharp Hayes, so she invited me up, and Jimmy Cross. In fact, about 2 weeks before I left, they had come to Florida, and we met in West Palm Beach on this whole idea of participation in a DC transmission line to Central Florida to Bellefonte, Alabama, to bring that power in. And they had come down, and we had met for like a day and a half there, just 2 weeks before I left. And anyway, when Mayor Sharpe, I had gone to TVA and make this overture to Jimmy Cross, who was the vice president of system planning at that time with TVA, about power marketing. So he knew that I'd left Florida Power and Light and do this. So he said, look, we've got another project, though, that's come up. In 1992, the Energy Policy Act was passed that opened the transmission system of all the utilities in the country to wheeling power through them for any wholesale customer. And so, okay. Florida Power and Light was already under that. That's what brought about the broker system, because everybody had to wheel, whether you own the transmission line or not. You had to provide access to it. But you got compensated for it.
Yeah.
But in Florida, it became a condition of the license of Unit 2 at St. Lucie plant. That when they gave us the operating license, they said, you've got to open your transmission system to everybody. Because we had partial ownership of that unit by other utilities. Florida Power and Light owned 80% of it, 20% owned by other companies. So you had to provide it. So they said, okay, you got to open all your transmission. Anyway, 1992, now that was back in 83. So we'd been under it for years. In fact, while I was a manager down there, that was common knowledge. You know, you wheel power for whoever wanted to. But not much was done until I got the power marketing thing going, and then we started doing it in big quantities. But TVA just opened in 1992. The law said you've got to open your transmission. So Mary Sharpes, the president, and Jimmy Cross, the vice president, came to me and says, since I was doing consulting, you did this in Florida. Can you show us how to do it? How do you do all this wheeling? I said, well, you got to get all these contracts with the neighboring utilities. You got to set up a tariff. You got to know how much it costs to do it. Would you take this on as a project to figure this out for us and lead that effort? I said, sure, I'm a consultant. Well, we'd like an exclusive contract for the next 3 months. That, I think, is $125 an hour for the next 3 months. I said, okay, I'll take it. We were living in our house in North Georgia. So what we would do is we'd come over to the hotel, and they, by the way, it was $125 plus expenses. So we'd come over and stay in the Reed House in Chattanooga from Sunday night through Thursday night, because we went home on Friday afternoon after I got off of work at Friday, and then we'd drive back to the mountain and stay there till Sunday afternoon. We made that trip every week, just about. We didn't go every week, but most every week. Some weeks we stayed over in the hotel, but we went back and forth, and I'd help. And I remember the lady that was in system planning, worked for Jimmy Cross. Oh. Miller was the last name. Pat Miller was there because her husband also worked for him, and he was a senior advisor. Bill Miller. Pat and Bill worked for Jimmy Cross. Well, Pat was in charge of writing the tariff. She was given the task of writing the tariff. So she and I sat down, and she was basically the author of it, and I told her what had to be in it, what didn't. So, well, we got to get a lawyer involved in it from the council's office, because it's got to be a legal document, and we got to get them. So we had a signed lawyer with us, and we drew up these tariffs. And they said, well, we got a little bit of a problem. Since we got them now, we got to get them approved by the board of directors, and then they got to be submitted to. I said, well, you just file them with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He said, no, we can't do that. TVA is an equal agency to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, both reporting to the president through Congress. And this is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission cannot rule on our tariff. They support it, but they can't rule on it because they are not over us. Oh, this is giving me a headache.
More difficult than power marketing.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So much for the power market. So I said, okay, all right. So Jimmy says, when we got it all done, ready to go, he says, and I gave it to him, and he said to present to the board of directors before we had to go to the FERC. And he says, well, I don't really understand all of this. You know it very well. How about you present it to the board of directors? I said, well, wait a minute. I don't know if I can do that. I'm not an employee. And I says, you're not supposed to have consultants do this. He said, well, let me talk to the chairman and see what we can do. So he said, okay, we'll make an exception. You present it as a consultant to the board of directors for approval, and I'll be there in the room with you. But you explain it because you know how to do it. So I went to the TVA board of directors, presented the plan. They loved it. The tariffs and all, it met all the requirements. And I remember the chairman says, well, we want to make sure that it is the best in the country. You've been doing this for years in Florida. Go through it again and make sure that if you have any question about any part of it, because this is going to be the de facto standard of transmission tariffs for every utility in the United States. I said, well, that's interesting. Okay, we did. So I took it back. We did some true up, and he says, now you've got to go sell it to every public service, every commissioner on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There's 5 commissioners, but you've got to do it one by one because they cannot meet as a body for TVA by law. Weird, but okay. So I went up there, since I had known them and I had talked to every one of them over the years with the presentations. I'd been there a number of times from Florida Power and Light. So I go into the chairman's office and I had an appointment with him. I tried to get them all together, but I couldn't get but like 3 of them on one time, so I had to go back up there for 2 more days to meet with them. And it's a very slow process. A lot of travel back and forth to Washington to do that. But I did up there. I remember sitting down with him, and he looks at me and he says, I think I know you, don't I? And I says, yeah, I used to be the vice president of Florida Power and Light. He says, and now you're a TVA? I said, no, I'm not with TVA. I'm just a consultant. And you're presenting this for TVA? Yeah. He said, okay. What you got? So I went through the whole thing.
Can we pause it right there? My battery's about to die.
Okay.